What happens when Hollywood's most respected legend sits down with one of television's most controversial hosts? You won't believe what unfolds when Clint Eastwood faces off against Bill Maher in what became the most explosive interview in late-night television history. The tension was palpable from the very first handshake, and by the end of the night, one of cinema's greatest icons would storm off set in a confrontation that left audiences stunned and social media buzzing. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two titans clash in the most dramatic showdown ever captured on live television. The stage was set for what should have been a routine promotional interview. Clint Eastwood, the 94-year-old legendary actor and director, had agreed to appear on Real Time with Bill Maher to discuss his latest directorial project and reflect on his decade-spanning career in Hollywood. The booking seemed like a perfect match, two outspoken figures known for their unfiltered opinions and willingness to tackle controversial subjects. But from the moment Eastwood walked onto that familiar set, something felt different. The studio audience erupted in applause as Eastwood made his entrance, moving with the same measured confidence that had defined his screen presence for over 6 decades. Dressed in a simple black suit with his trademark stoic expression, he approached Maher's desk with the kind of quiet authority that only comes from a lifetime of commanding respect. Maher, sporting his usual smirk and clearly relishing the opportunity to interview such an iconic figure, stood to greet his guest with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. "Ladies and gentlemen, the one and only Clint Eastwood," Maher announced, to thunderous applause, extending his hand for what should have been a cordial greeting. But even in those first moments, observant viewers could sense an underlying tension. Eastwood's handshake was firm but brief, his eyes studying Maher with the same intensity he'd brought to countless Western showdowns. There was something in that look, a wariness that suggested this wouldn't be the typical celebrity softball interview. As they settled into their seats, Maher launched into his opening remarks with his characteristic blend of humor and edge. "You know, Clint, I've got to say, at 94, you're still making movies while most people your age are arguing about their medication with their nurses. What's your secret? Is it the cigars, the whiskey, or just pure stubborn determination?" The audience chuckled, but Eastwood's response was measured, almost cautious. "Well, Bill, I suppose it's about staying engaged with what matters. Making films that have something to say, working with people who share that vision." His voice carried that familiar gravelly tone, but there was an undercurrent of something else, perhaps disappointment in the host's flippant approach to what should have been a more respectful conversation. Maher, seemingly oblivious to the subtle warning signs, pressed forward with his typical irreverent style. "Speaking of having something to say, your films have always tackled heavy subjects: war, justice, morality. But let's be honest, some of your earlier work hasn't exactly aged well in our current climate. I mean, Dirty Harry? Today's audiences might see that as glorifying police brutality and toxic masculinity." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Eastwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his eyes narrowed in a way that anyone familiar with his films would recognize as a danger sign. The audience, sensing the shift in energy, grew quieter, their laughter becoming more nervous and sparse. "I think," Eastwood replied slowly, his words carefully chosen, "that people who actually watch those films understand they're about complex characters dealing with impossible situations. Harry Callahan wasn't meant to be a role model. He was a man pushed to his limits by a system that had failed." But Maher wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed energized by the pushback, leaning forward in his chair with that familiar gleam in his eye that suggested he was about to drop a verbal bomb. "Come on, Clint. You can't tell me that when you were making those films, you were thinking about the deeper sociological implications. You were making entertainment for audiences who wanted to see the bad guys get what was coming to them. Simple as that." The condescension in Maher's tone was unmistakable, and even viewers at home could feel the disrespect radiating through their screens. Here was a talk show host, barely half Eastwood's age, attempting to lecture one of cinema's most accomplished directors about the meaning and intent of his own work. The audacity was breathtaking, and Eastwood's reaction was swift and pointed. "Bill," Eastwood said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I've been making films longer than you've been alive. I think I have a pretty good understanding of what I was trying to accomplish." The words were delivered with the kind of quiet intensity that had made Eastwood famous, but there was steel beneath the surface, a warning that Maher seemed determined to ignore. Instead of recognizing that he'd crossed a line, Maher doubled down with a laugh that sounded increasingly forced. "Oh, come on, don't pull the age card on me. We're just having a conversation here. You've always been known for speaking your mind, so let's really talk. What about your political evolution? You've been all over the map, supporting both Republican and Democratic candidates. Some people might call that inconsistent, or maybe just opportunistic." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunfight, and the studio audience fell into an uncomfortable silence. Even Maher's typically supportive crowd seemed to recognize that their host had ventured into dangerous territory. Eastwood's hands, which had been resting casually on the arms of his chair, slowly clenched into fists. "Opportunistic?" Eastwood repeated, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of decades of earned authority. "I've never endorsed a candidate or taken a political stance for any reason other than what I believed was right for this country. The fact that you would suggest otherwise says more about your character than mine." The word character landed like a slap across Maher's face, and for the first time since the interview began, the host seemed to realize he might have miscalculated. But rather than backing down or attempting to salvage the situation with grace, Maher's ego kicked in, and he made the fatal mistake of trying to regain control through even more aggressive tactics. "Look, I'm just saying what a lot of people are thinking," Maher continued, his voice rising slightly as he sensed he was losing the upper hand. "You've built this reputation as this straight-shooting, no-nonsense guy, but when you really examine your career, there's a lot of contradiction there. The tough guy image, the political flip-flopping, even that bizarre conversation you had with an empty chair at the Republican National Convention. People are still trying to figure out what that was all about." The mention of the empty chair incident, Eastwood's improvised speech at the 2012 Republican National Convention that had been widely mocked by critics, was the final straw. The reference was clearly intended to humiliate and belittle, and everyone in the studio knew it. Eastwood's entire demeanor shifted, his shoulders squaring as he fixed Maher with a stare that could have melted steel. "That's enough," Eastwood said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The two words carried such authority that even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. The legendary actor slowly rose from his chair, his movement deliberate and commanding, as the studio fell into absolute silence. But Maher, either too proud or too foolish to recognize the gravity of the moment, made one final, catastrophic error. In judgment that would transform this uncomfortable interview into television history. "Sit down, Clint," Maher said with a dismissive wave of his hand, his voice dripping with condescension. "We're not done here. You can't just walk away every time someone asks you tough questions. That might work on your movie sets, but this is my show." The words hit the studio like a thunderclap. The sheer disrespect of ordering a 94-year-old cinema legend to sit down like a scolded child sent shockwaves through everyone present. You could literally hear gasps from the audience, and even the production crew seemed stunned by their host's audacity. Eastwood stopped mid-stride, his back still turned to Maher, and for a moment that felt like an eternity, nobody moved. When Eastwood slowly turned around, his face was a mask of controlled fury that would have made his most intimidating Western characters look tame by comparison. His eyes had turned to ice, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet menace that could stop a charging bull. "What did you just say to me?" The question was delivered with surgical precision, each word carefully enunciated and loaded with decades of earned authority. The studio audience was so quiet you could hear the cameras whirring, and even Maher seemed to finally grasp that he had crossed a line from which there might be no return. But instead of apologizing or attempting to defuse the situation, Maher's ego took complete control, perhaps sensing that backing down now would make him look weak in front of his audience, or maybe just intoxicated by his own sense of power as the show's host. He doubled down with a recklessness that bordered on professional suicide. "You heard me," Maher replied, leaning back in his chair with forced casualness, though observant viewers could see the slight tremor in his hands. "This isn't the Wild West, and you're not some untouchable movie star who gets to intimidate people into submission. You came on my show, so you play by my rules." If you can't handle honest questions about your career and your politics, maybe you should stick to making movies about talking to furniture. The reference to the empty chair incident again, delivered with such calculated cruelty, was like throwing gasoline on a fire. The audience audibly groaned, many shaking their heads in disbelief at their host's behavior. Even Maher's most loyal supporters in the crowd seemed uncomfortable with the vicious turn the interview had taken. Eastwood took a step closer to Maher's desk, his movement predatory and deliberate. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of a man who had commanded respect for nearly 7 decades in one of the world's toughest industries. Let me tell you something about rules. Bill, Eastwood began, his eyes never leaving Maher's face. I've been in this business since before you were born. I've worked with legends, directed masterpieces, and earned every bit of respect I've received through decades of hard work and professionalism. You, on the other hand, built your career on cheap shots and shocking people for attention. The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Maher's facade of confidence began to crack, and for the first time since the interview began, he looked genuinely unsettled. But Eastwood wasn't finished. He moved even closer, now standing directly beside Maher's desk, towering over the seated host with an intimidating presence that filled the entire studio. You want to talk about honest questions? Eastwood continued, his voice gaining strength and conviction. Then let's be honest about what this really is. You brought me here not to have a real conversation about my work or my life, but to try to tear me down for your own entertainment. You think disrespecting your guests makes you edgy, makes you relevant. It doesn't. It makes you a bully with a microphone. The studio had become a powder keg, with tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Audience members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, some looking toward the exits as if they expected the situation to turn physical. The production crew stood frozen, unsure whether to keep rolling or cut to commercial. Maher, his face, now flushed with a combination of anger and embarrassment, made yet another catastrophic decision. Instead of accepting the devastating critique with whatever dignity he had left, he chose to escalate further, apparently believing he could somehow regain control of the situation through even more aggressive behavior. "Oh, please," Maher scoffed, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "Don't lecture me about bullying when you've made a career out of playing characters who solve problems with violence. And let's be real here. You're upset because I'm asking questions that other interviewers are too starstruck to ask. Maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe the problem is that you can't handle being challenged by someone who isn't afraid of your reputation." The accusation that Eastwood couldn't handle being challenged was perhaps the most insulting thing Maher could have said. Here was a man who had not only survived but thrived in Hollywood for over 6 decades, who had transitioned from actor to director to producer, who had tackled controversial subjects and difficult themes throughout his career, being told by a talk show host that he couldn't handle tough questions. That Eastwood's response was swift and devastating. Challenged. He let out a short, bitter laugh that sent chills through everyone watching. "Son, I've been challenged by studio executives, critics, audiences, and politicians for longer than you can imagine. I've made films that dealt with war, racism, violence, and redemption. I've been criticized, praised, and everything in between. What you're doing isn't challenging. It's disrespectful, unprofessional, and frankly, pathetic." The word pathetic hung in the air like a death sentence, and Maher's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, and finally, something approaching panic. He was losing control of his own show, being systematically dismantled by a guest who clearly had no intention of playing by the typical celebrity interview rules. "You know what your real problem is, Bill?" Eastwood continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority and experience. "You've spent so long hiding behind your desk, taking cheap shots at people from a safe distance, that you've forgotten what real courage looks like. You think being controversial means being brave, but there's nothing brave about insulting your guests for laughs." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word of what had become less an interview than a public reckoning. Maher tried to interrupt several times, but Eastwood's presence was so commanding that even attempting to speak seemed futile. "I've directed films about heroes and villains, about good and evil, about what it means to stand up for what's right," Eastwood said, his voice building to a crescendo. "And I can tell you this, a real man doesn't need to tear others down to build himself up. A real man treats his guests with respect, regardless of whether he agrees with them or not." Maher, desperate to regain some semblance of control, made one final, devastating mistake that would seal his fate and create a moment that would be replayed millions of times across social media. "Listen, old man," Maher said, his voice cracking slightly as he stood up from behind his desk, pointing his finger directly at Eastwood's chest. "I don't care how many movies you've made or how old you are. This is my house, and you don't get to come in here and lecture me about respect. Maybe it's time you retired and let the younger generation handle things, because clearly you can't keep up with how the world works anymore." The studio fell into absolute silence. The insult was so shocking, so completely beyond the bounds of acceptable behavior, that even the most seasoned production crew members stood with their mouths agape. Calling a 94-year-old legend an old man and suggesting he should retire wasn't just disrespectful. It was career suicide broadcast live to millions of viewers. Eastwood's reaction was immediate and final. His entire demeanor shifted from controlled anger to something far more dangerous, complete and utter contempt. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that had commanded respect on movie sets for decades, but now it was laced with a finality that made everyone in the studio understand that something irreversible was about to happen. "Old man," Eastwood repeated, his voice so quiet it was barely audible, yet somehow it filled the entire studio. He took one step closer to Maher, close enough that the host instinctively took a step backward. "Let me tell you something about this old man, son. This old man has more integrity in his little finger than you have in your entire body." The power in Eastwood's voice was mesmerizing. Every person in that studio, from the audience members to the camera operators to the producers watching from the control room, was completely captivated by what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a celebrity meltdown or a heated argument. This was a masterclass in dignity under fire. "This old man has created films that will be remembered long after your little comedy show is canceled and forgotten," Eastwood continued, his eyes boring into Maher's with laser-like intensity. "This old man has worked with the greatest actors, directors, and writers in Hollywood history, and earned their respect through professionalism and talent, not by insulting guests for cheap laughs." Maher tried to interrupt, opening his mouth to speak, but Eastwood held up a single finger, a gesture so commanding that it instantly silenced the host without a word being spoken. The power dynamics in the room had completely shifted, and everyone could feel it. "You want to talk about how the world works?" Eastwood asked, his voice building with controlled fury. "Let me explain how the world really works. Respect is earned, not demanded. Character is built through your actions, not your words. And a man's worth isn't measured by his age or his ability to shock people, but by how he treats others and the legacy he leaves behind." The legendary actor began walking slowly around Maher's desk, each step deliberate and purposeful, like a predator circling its prey. Maher remained frozen in place, clearly out of his depth and unable to comprehend how completely he had lost control of his own show. "You sit behind this desk every night, taking shots at people who aren't here to defend themselves," Eastwood continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You make jokes about politicians, celebrities, and public figures because it's safe. It's easy. It requires no courage whatsoever. But when someone sits down across from you and calls you out for what you really are, you can't handle it." The audience was completely mesmerized. Many were pulling out their phones, recording what they instinctively knew would become one of the most viral moments in television history. Others simply sat in stunned silence, witnessing the complete dismantling of a television host by one of cinema's greatest legends. "What am I, Bill?" Eastwood asked, stopping directly in front of the host, towering over him with decades of earned authority. "What am I really?" Maher opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in his career, the man who made his living through quick wit and sharp comebacks was completely speechless. "I'll tell you what you are," Eastwood said, answering his own question. "You're a small man who thinks controversy equals relevance. You're someone who confuses being offensive with being intelligent. And most importantly, you're someone who has never learned the most basic lesson of human decency, treating others with respect." The devastating assessment hit its target with surgical precision. Maher's face had gone completely pale, and small beads of sweat were visible on his forehead despite the studio's air conditioning. He looked like a man who was watching his career implode in real time. I've spent 94 years on this earth, Eastwood continued, his voice now carrying the weight of nearly a century of life experience. I've seen wars, witnessed incredible changes in society, worked with thousands of talented people, and learned countless lessons about what it means to be a decent human being. And one thing I've never had to do is insult my guests to make myself feel important. Eastwood paused, letting the words sink in before delivering his final, devastating blow. You call me an old man like it was an insult. But you know what? I'm proud to be an old man. I'm proud of every year I've lived, every film I've made, every person I've worked with, and every lesson I've learned. What are you proud of, Bill? What's your legacy going to be? That you were really good at making people uncomfortable on television? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Maher looked around desperately, perhaps hoping for support from his audience or his crew, but found only uncomfortable stares and disappointed faces. Even his most loyal fans seemed horrified by his behavior. Eastwood straightened his suit jacket with the same calm precision he had displayed in countless Western films, then looked directly into the main camera, addressing the viewing audience at home. Ladies and gentlemen, I came here tonight to have a conversation about my work and my life. Instead, I was subjected to disrespect and insults by a host who apparently believes that treating his guests poorly is entertaining. I won't be part of that kind of show. He turned back to Maher one final time, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying more power than any shout could have managed. You have a platform that reaches millions of people every night, Bill. You could use it to educate, to inspire, to bring people together. Instead, you choose to divide and insult. That's not just unprofessional. It's a waste of an incredible opportunity. With that, Clint Eastwood turned and began walking toward the exit, his stride confident and purposeful. The studio remained in absolute silence as one of Hollywood's greatest legends made his way off the stage, his dignity intact and his reputation enhanced by how he had handled an impossible situation. As Eastwood reached the edge of the stage, he paused and looked back one final time. Good luck, Bill. You're going to need it. The studio doors closed behind him with a soft thud that somehow sounded like thunder in the deathly quiet space. For several long moments, nobody moved. Maher stood frozen behind his desk, his face a mask of shock and humiliation. The audience sat in stunned silence, many shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had witnessed. Finally, a producer's voice could be heard from the control room. We're going to commercial. The words broke the spell, and suddenly the studio erupted into chaos as crew members scrambled to figure out how to salvage what remained of the show. As the cameras stopped rolling and the lights dimmed, it was clear that everyone present had witnessed something unprecedented in television history. A legendary actor had walked off a major talk show, but he hadn't stormed off in anger or thrown a tantrum. Instead, he had delivered a masterclass in dignity, respect, and what it truly means to be a professional. The confrontation was over, but its impact was just beginning to be felt across social media and throughout the entertainment industry, forever changing how people viewed both the legendary actor who had handled himself with such grace under fire and the talk show host who had revealed his true character on live television.